Hello, hey everyone. Thanks for joining us. Marie and I worked together. We worked at Airbnb together, and we were just saying right before this call how awesome of a team it was. Because even though we never worked on projects together, we still felt like we were part of like one cohesive team. So it was such a treat to work with Marie and actually collaborate on this. Although most of this is Marie, I'm just gonna ask some questions as we go throughout. But yeah, really excited to welcome Marie and really feel privileged to have this chance to work with her.
Hey everyone, I'm so excited to be here. Chris, thank you so much for inviting me. I'm really excited to talk today. As you mentioned, we were at Airbnb together a long time ago. I see Jen and Emily and a few other folks popping up in the chat. So always a fun reunion vibe. So Chris, should we just kick this off, or is there anything else that you like to
Oh,
do?
let's get into it. I'm so excited. We got a lot of content. We had a lot of questions from people. Like these were the questions that people submitted coming into this were probably the best ones we've had yet in this AI club thing. So thanks to everybody who submitted questions. I think it helped us sort of orient this presentation. We probably won't get to all the questions. We're going to try to integrate them throughout. Marie's got so much great content that I think speaks to a lot of the questions. But yeah, to that point, ask questions in the chat. We'll try to monitor that. We'll probably miss some stuff. We probably won't get to all the questions, but we'll definitely have a good discussion. So take it away, Marie.
All right. So, super excited to talk about AI slop today. And as Chris mentioned, the questions that came in were really, really great. We were able to integrate a bunch of those in throughout. So, if you asked a question, you might see some things that touch on that throughout. And as we kick this off, I really just wanted to start by touching on what we're talking about when we talk about slop. So, in my mind, I think this generally means two things. The first one is bad outputs. And there was a super interesting question about, is Slop a new AI thing? Has this always been around? What's going on here? In my mind, Slop has been around for as long as people have been creating media and content. Slop is just something that's messy. It's a bad output. It's something that you don't enjoy reading. It looks bad. When you think back on maybe, 2010s OOs, you won't believe this one cool trick like listicle headlines. In my mind, that is the precursor to AI slop. It's easy to make and it's low quality. I think on the other hand, we have hallucinations as a really different type of slop. This is something that's a little bit more insidious. It's not obviously wrong. For the first type, if you're looking at it, you can probably tell if it's slop. It's something that doesn't look good. For the second type, you might need to go a little bit deeper into the data, into the insights, into whatever you're looking at to tell if it's slop or if it's something that's credible. So, moving on there, a few things for us today. I'm going to take a minute to start to talk about heuristics to frame how I'm thinking about avoiding AI slop. Second, we'll go through a little bit of a framework that I've been thinking of is using AI in the loop. We've all heard about humans in the loop as a really canonical framework, but if we're thinking about almost inverting that and taking human workflows and looking for opportunities to use AI to make them even more useful and productive, we'll go through that and then spend the majority of our time on more specific examples and ways that you can integrate AI into your research practice to get outputs that are great and avoid creating slop. Chris will be chatting with me throughout. And then if you have questions, please drop them in the chat. Feel free to jump in. Super excited to make this more of a discussion as we move through. Chris, anything else you want to add to get us started?
No, that's great. Great overview. I love the framing in general of slop. It's not just garbage, bad output. I think there's a lot of layers to it and dimensions that I think we're going to unpack. But yeah, let's get into it.
Yeah, awesome. And then just one last thing, we will be sending this deck out afterward. It's got a lot more specific detail in the speaker notes. So if any of the examples are interesting to you, if you want to go back and look at those, we'll send out a version of this later. Okay, so first, heuristics. So some things that I've been thinking about as kind of a guide for when I use AI in my work when it feels like it's super useful. First and foremost, thinking about where it's augmenting what I'm doing versus trying to replace it. I think as AI advances, we'll be able to replace more and more tasks in a way that's really useful. For now, I think it's something that's much more of an augmenter to get to a better output. Second, remember why you're doing what you're doing. I think a trend that I've noticed at times, not just thinking about UX research, but thinking about all kinds of different things that suddenly AI can do, a lot of different vibe coding use cases. It becomes this, oh, cool, I can do or I can make this amazing thing. And that's true that you can, but I think a lot of those almost feel like toy use cases where it's great, you can vibe code this thing, cool, but there's not that rigorous thinking that would go into something where you need to spend the effort. It's almost like this proportionality between it's so easy, let me just try it, which on one hand is amazing and it's a really cool way to explore ideas. But I think as you're thinking about doing research with AI, don't forget the
那我去
basic.
了。
Oh, did you have a? Okay, back on mute. Cool. Don't forget the basics. Really make sure you still consider what you're trying to learn, what decisions you're trying to inform, the context that you're operating within. AI certainly does not replace writing a brief to map out your research, even if you use it as a tool there. I think that clarity and thinking about the purpose is really, really important to set yourself up to use AI in a productive way. Third, a point that I've seen come up recently in a bunch of ways, and I was chatting with Chris yesterday, and he's been saying this as well. I think considering that you are still responsible for what you put out into the world is another great heuristic. If you're doing work with AI, you're still putting your name on it. And I like to think about it as a researcher. If this was something I was doing on my own, would I be proud to put this out there? As a research manager, if this was something that someone on my team was doing, if I was reviewing this, would I give them feedback? What is that feedback? What changes would I make? I think it's still possible to hold this really high quality bar, even if you're using AI as a tool or a collaborator.
And I just to double click on that,
Yeah.
I'm sure we'll get into it, but I just want to
Yeah.
this is the one that as we talked yesterday, I just can't stop thinking about because I think it's
Hmm.
so important. And I think it's manifesting in a lot of different domains. Like obviously we're talking about UX research here, but like I've seen this literal discussion happen with engineers who of course are using like AI coding tools. Maybe they're like the front edge of this whole movement. And there's like there's there's this like tension between wanting to use these tools, you wanting to use AI to move as quickly as possible and like just have it do it. And then but then it's tempting to like forego that responsibility and be like, well, I trust it, so I don't need to check everything, or I don't need to worry, and just almost becoming like too complacent with it. And I think it's
Mm.
just such an important point to like remember that ultimately you are responsible. This is your work, even if you're using AI to help you generate it. And I think you'll talk about using how it fits into the workflow, but like ultimately it's your name on the line. And I just feel like this is like maybe the most important part. If you just take away one thing, I feel like this is like maybe a really important guiding principle.
Yeah, Chris, I agree. And as you were just saying that, I was thinking, I feel like such an important part of research overall is trade-offs. And I mean, as I'm sure most people here know, if you've ever gone through an interview loop as a UXR, someone will ask you about what trade-offs would you make if you had to do this study differently. And I've been really using that framing thinking about AI because it is so much faster, but it does have really distinct quality trade-offs at this point in time. And I think that to me, and I think to a lot of other researchers, has been a good framework just to consider what are the trade-offs. This is something else in your toolkit. This is not a silver bullet. So, just wrapping up this slide really quickly, a few other things I've been thinking about. I think a big one for me is understanding when I'm writing to think versus writing to communicate. I think writing, is and continues to be for a lot of people a really powerful tool to work through your own ideas. My perspective is that that is when AI is not a good tool to use. If you are writing to work through an idea, maybe you can use it to brainstorm, but keep doing that writing on your own. Think about what you're thinking about, process it. Versus when you're writing to communicate, AI can be a really powerful tool to make sure that you're landing your points with your audience, considering their perspectives, polishing something if that's helpful for you, and getting it into a format that's useful for other people. And then just the last two couple of things here. One thing I found to be most helpful is breaking out what I'm trying to do with AI into clearly defined tasks. At this point in time, for UXR flows I've tried, it doesn't do a great job with a wholesale task. You can't say, hey, go run this study and it gives you something amazing, or even, hey, go analyze all these interview transcripts. You have to really think about what are the different steps I need to take, which ones are either frustrating, they're annoying, I don't want to do them, they take a lot of time, and then break it into, okay, which of these can AI actually do? And again, going back to this idea of it being a loop with you, which parts are you doing? Which parts is it doing? And then finally, thinking about our discipline overall, one thing I'm super excited about, Chris and I were also chatting about this a little bit yesterday. I think that using AI as a tool is going to really enable researchers to be far more mixed methods than most people have ever been. I think that this will put a lot more importance on asking really good questions, investigating the right areas, but then take some burden off on needing to have deep methodological expertise about all the different methods, tool use. I think it really shifts it into more, you need to know what exists, what they're good for, but less you need to be a deep practitioner of statistics, of being able to code in R or Python, of knowing all about different qualitative methods, and more awareness of when you would use those. All right, so moving forward here. Um, three things today that we'll talk about, three different ways I'm either using AI or really seeing it used that are interesting, getting started with research, offloading tasks, and then better outputs. I am going to spend the vast majority of our time on offloading tasks and just quickly note getting started. So I think one thing I've been reflecting on a lot recently is AI can make a great thought partner for research design. So, for instance, if you have a method in mind, research questions, maybe you even have a question bank for screeners for a survey or something. If you pop that into really any AI chatbot tool, you can just talk to it about, hey, I want to do this research. This is what I'm trying to learn. And it can produce a great kind of rough draft of these are survey questions you could easily put into Qualtrics. These are diary study questions you could easily put into, Dscout or another similar platform. These are interview questions you could use to start making a moderation guide. So that's been just a really nice, lightweight way to get started with AI. And
Maybe
then, yeah,
sorry to interrupt, but I
yeah,
think there's something we talked about yesterday, which I think
yeah.
this is reminding me of. Like, there's the tools that, if you work at a place, you probably have certain tools like you might use Google tools, use Microsoft tools, OpenAI, Anthropic. Like, there's a lot of different choices, but usually it's like there's certain tools that you are like allowed to use with like
Mhm.
official data or like PII data. But I think a lot of these, so like that can feel sometimes like a limitation. Like we only have access to this tool, but I really want to use that tool. But for a lot of the, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like for a lot of the things, this like thought partner type thing, it's
Yeah.
often not confidential.
Mhm.
Sometimes it could be, but a lot of times it's not, and it's more of just like help me write a survey. I use it all the time for like. What's a way to like phrase this like survey question so it's a 5 point like unipolar Likert scale about this vague idea I have in my head, like that's not confidential at all. And there's certain models that I feel like are better at helping with that. Anyway, I just wanted to bring that up as like don't feel like limited to whatever tool you like have to use because a lot of times you can use other tools, if it's not confidential or whatever it is.
Yeah, Chris, I think that's a great point about tools generally. Throughout this, you'll see a couple different categories of things. One is something that's pretty tool agnostic. You should be able to do this with really any tool like this one. For some of these, I'm just going to talk about the tool that I've found works best. Some of my, work contexts is I do work at Google, so I'm using a lot of Google tools, but this is something where if you have access to a different tool, you could probably try that in a similar way. Obviously, at work, use whatever tools you are, allowed to use with data. And then we do have a couple examples as well later on, Chris, some of the quant data ones that are some kind of nice ways to use AI where you're then taking parts of the output out of the tool. So you could, again, use really any tool. You're not putting anything confidential in. You're able to use kind of a combination of generating code, and then also you can use fake data to get the right code to run outside of the AI.
Yep.
All right, so let's start by talking about lit reviews. So I'm going to treat this as a few different things, both lit reviews and also repositories. So there have been kind of two different directions that I've been exploring a lot that have been super nice here. The first one has been a method for both internal lit reviews. So if you work at a company that has a lot of existing research, you have a bunch of files already, and then also building like a living repository. I've been using NotebookLM for this, and it's really great because you upload all of your sources and it will ground on them. So this is better, I've found, than using some other tools that might hallucinate more. You're able to upload things from Google Drive. You can put in videos, you can put in links, you can put in, I think, PDFs. There are a bunch of different file formats. But it's a really nice way if you want to start by understanding what's already known about a topic. You can put this in. For a lit review, you can just put in your research questions or themes that you want to go deeper on. And then you're able to ask more questions of it. And then if you do have an area where you're really building a body of knowledge, you can keep adding sources over time and make this more of a living artifact. It's also really shareable within teams if you're able to use it at work. I think on the con side, it's still not 100% hallucination proof. I don't think anything is at this point. And if you want it to understand context or limitations of different data sets or studies, like for example, I was doing something recently and had, a few surveys that were an N of 3,000 and then a bunch of user testing that was an N of 8 or interviews that were an N of 15. You do have to really manually provide a lot of context if there are constraints for different types of data. But for something to just kind of get started, get a lay of the land, it's great. And then, as I mentioned, this idea of creating a repository, when I've been trying to do that with AI, experimenting with a bunch of different methods, I think this has really been my favorite so far for making a reusable and shareable repository. And then on the flip side, academic lit reviews, which this has been a really fun one. And Chris and I were having a great time talking about this yesterday. So, over the course of my career, I have almost never done academic lit reviews in tech because they take forever and you have to have a really, really good sense for what you're looking at. I think that there are a lot of contexts where there's relevant research from cognitive science, psych, HCI, whatever, that can really help you frame how you're thinking about a design or product or tech problem. But you have to know what you're looking for. It takes a few weeks. If you weren't right, it was kind of a waste of time. You have to read all these journal articles. Something I've been exploring recently is doing either deep research or this feature that Chris and I kind of discovered yesterday that's great called Google Scholar Labs, where if you go on Google Scholar, you're trying to find an academic paper, they actually have a deep research like feature built in where you can ask questions and it will ground super, super well just in academic articles that have been published. So you're really limited to that like scholar corpus of data. This has been a really nice way to understand anything that might be relevant. Something I've been doing is, okay, I've got hypotheses. I'm pretty sure, there are relevant concepts in HCI. Let me do like 4 or 5 of these and just see if there's a there that might direct you to one paper you need to read instead of 25. You might find out there's nothing, but it's really fast. I think deep research on most tools is usually a paid feature, so that's kind of a downside. But it's been a nice way to really pull in more of this basis of, deeper understanding, academic understanding that wasn't necessarily possible before. And then another thing that Chris and I were chatting about yesterday that's just really fun. There's this concept that I absolutely love in meta science that's called undocumented synonymy, which is this idea that concepts from one field can help advance another. So a lot of the canonical examples there are there's, a construct in biology, someone in chemistry, somehow by talking to a colleague or happening to read the right paper, understands this concept. It's super useful. It pushes their work forward. I think that there are probably some analogs we can start to get into here, where maybe it's not biology and chemistry, but maybe you're thinking about a design challenge and there's something in economics or in philosophy that could really help you advance that work. And starting to be able to ask questions like, this is the problem I'm working through. Is there published research from any field that's relevant? I think is a really new and exciting capability.
So, am I? No, I'm not muted. Okay.
You're not muted.
Okay, this is such a good point because this discussion we had yesterday about lit review, I think, made me think about this in sort of a different way, which is there's like to this topic of like slop, like there's like part of it I think is like knowing when to use AI in ways that like tend to not lead to slop. Like there's certain ways you can use AI where like the probability of slop is like really high. Like, ooh, if you don't use it exactly right, it's probably gonna be super sloppy. Whereas the lit review seems like, and I'm curious what your thoughts are on this, like generally just it's hard to like misuse it in a way that leads to slop. But I want to challenge that. Is that a correct sort of assumption that like if you pull stuff into NotebookLM, it will do a good job of grounding itself in the sources? Or if you are using deep research, there's a lot of different tools for deep research.
Mhm.
Is it that those are generally like slop free, or are there certain things you have to do when you're doing lit reviews to like to steer clear of like sort of some slop traps?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think when I think about the outputs I've gotten from NotebookLM or from deep research, I probably would not copy and paste them into something and share them with other people. With deep research, once you get the longer output, if you scan it, if you ask it to summarize it, make you a table of key findings, something like that, those will be pretty good. I think for any of these outputs, if you're doing a lot of copy and pasting, it's still really important to, take a pass through, make sure everything makes sense, really read it. For NotebookLM, I'm not sure I've ever exported or copied things out. I've usually found it more useful as something just to have a conversation with, and it's more of like a learning tool versus an output generating tool. I think I would probably hold the same principle. If you're doing a lot of copying and pasting, I think for any generative tool, like really taking a read through is important. I know that I've done that a handful of times for deep research, for instance, and gotten through it, and it's like, oh, these are great points, and I get to paragraph 8, and I'm like, what? That is that even a sentence? So I think, trying to avoid like that, making it into work you share is really important.
Yeah, I love that. That's cool.
All right. So now moving on a little bit, let's talk about qualitative data analysis and synthesis. This was something we got a ton of questions on that were really great. Personally for me, I think this is one of the areas that I'm most excited about. I think qualitative data analysis, especially if you have a larger diary study, you have a bunch of unstructured text, you have lots of survey open ends, maybe even historically limited by how many open ends you can do because you don't want to analyze the data. I think this is something that's still maturing. It definitely takes a lot of finessing to make it not slop, but it's interesting and it's exciting. And I've been experimenting with this a lot, and I've got a doc, and again, we'll share this out afterward. I'll pull it up in a second, but some sample prompts to use where this is an example from a study that I did last year where I just wanted to see how much analysis I could do using an AI chatbot. I ran a pretty large unmoderated study on Dscout. I think it was an N of around 50 participants. They answered a variety of question types. There were some short videos that there were transcripts from. I had them in different cohorts because I wanted to try something with multiple CSVs. And this was something that was it was a fun experiment. It ended up being a lot more back and forth than I expected. I was a little bit humbled at how sloppy the output was at first. But a few things I learned here. If you can get your qual data into some kind of a structure before you ingest it, so if you have a diary study, that works super well because it's probably going to export into a CSV that will have question titles at the top. If the codes look weird, it's really easy to go back in and just lightly clean your data to change them to something readable. If you have interview transcripts, if you can put them into a spreadsheet, if you can put them into a doc where the question is in it, but just doing something where there's that structure of this was the question, this was the response for all the participants versus this is just data, that seems to help a lot. And then I think also, depending on the format, if you're able to upload like the moderation guide, what your research questions were, the brief, I think giving that grounding context of what your goals are is also super helpful. A few other things, really thinking about partial analysis versus getting a full report. When I was going through this, I was able to, by stepping through, get it to a point where I got a really good partial analysis that was still way too long. I think it was about 10 pages, but it did ultimately provide a good thematic analysis, tons of participant quotes, and I was able to go back through and then kind of massage that into a final report. So again, this is not producing, the most beautiful research report you can send out to people, but I found that it did offload a lot of things that would have taken, several days, a week into something where I could go back through and polish a report. And then I think finally, managing hallucinations is just a huge thing here. So going in, let me see. I need to switch this tab. Um,
We're good. We can see the
you can
sample.
see that tab. Okay, perfect. I'm sorry. I am not used to using
No.
Zoom. And yeah, so this is something, and again, we'll share this afterward, but just some sample prompts for doing qualitative data analysis. I think one of the biggest things to keep in mind is that it can hallucinate quotes and it can even hallucinate an entire CSV. So doing checks throughout to make sure it's not hallucinating. The process I followed here, and again, I was using Dscout in this particular example. You can use any tool that you're getting data from. This is really just meant to reflect what I did in this example. You'll get your CSVs, make sure you name them clearly. Really think of this as like basic data cleaning. If you were going to do, quant analysis and upload a CSV, and you'd probably want to make sure that the columns were named clearly. In Gemini, you want to use canvas mode. It's the same thing you use for vibe coding. This tends to work best for this type of analysis. And then I found that really explaining to Gemini that I want it to be a UX researcher, I want it to be a good UX researcher, someone who's experienced, succinct, communicates clearly, kind of going through all of this, explaining what the columns are. If you reuse this, you'll need to obviously go through, make sure you've got the right column names in, CSV names. This is from a specific example that I did. For verbatims, one of the bigger things I identified to prevent hallucinations was making sure there was a column that was a participant ID or the participant name, and telling it that every time it produced a verbatim, it needed to cite which row it was from and then also the name and ID. And that cut down really, really, really dramatically. So that was a nice, just kind of easy thing to do. And then if you ask for more verbatims or more quotes, every time you do it, make sure that you say that again. And then I think there was also a really interesting comment that I saw pop up in the chat a minute ago about maybe LLMs being like bats and having just a really different like model of the world. Anytime you're thinking about a construct, so like in this, the idea of compelling participant quotes, verbatims, tell it what you mean. Verbatims to the LLM could mean literally anything that is written verbatim in your study. I think here, I'm not sure if it's actually in this one or not, but just explaining, I want interesting quotes. I want things that illustrate this research question, really being clear about what you mean by a verbatim. You could also think of this as, this is like the newest intern ever who's never done UX research before. How would you explain this to them? Or this is a PM who you're teaching how to do UXR. How would you explain to them what to look for? Make sure you explain to the AI what it's looking for, not just the output that you want. And then just going through here kind of quickly, lots of checks on hallucinations. Also, the first time you put the CSV in, ask it to produce a few rows, go back and check, make sure it did not hallucinate a new CSV. I've run into this quite a bit where sometimes it's like something like the upload doesn't work, and then it decides to be really helpful and just makes a new data set. So you want to avoid that. And then as you're going through, you can refine, you can add in more files. This is something that's also really nice, being able to kind of merge multiple CSVs together if your data is collected in that way. If there's a relationship between the files, explain what that is. If there's a difference in data structure, make sure you specify it. And then going through, another thing that was really nice that I realized, you've probably noticed in Slop, your AI, it tends to use some really like distinctive phrases that sound pretty weird. You can go through and ask it to change the tone, to take out specific phrases if there's something popping up a lot. If it's too dramatic, you can tone that down. If it's overly academic, you can tone that down. Really, just however you want to adjust it, give it that feedback and you can revise your output. If you're getting markdown for some reason, you can tell it to make sure that's doc readable and you can post it into a doc. And then going through, and this is really just cleanup, you can do things like adding a table of contents. You can ask it to tighten up the writing if there are too many examples, if you want different verbatims. If it's really long, asking it to remove anything superfluous that doesn't support the main points, that works really nicely. And then finally, as like a last step, fixing hallucinations. I like to just throw that in a lot, just to have it recheck. I'm not sure if that's 100% necessary, but I did find as I was working through this particular example, kind of going back to that did seem to really help reduce them. Chris, any other things you want to throw in here?
No, this
Anything?
is great. I just love how practical this advice is. These are like, and we'll share this doc too. Like, feel free to take a screenshot if you want. Pro tip on a Mac, you can screenshot and then bring it into preview, and you can select the text in the screenshot. I think I feel like this is where so much slop. I made a comment in the chat. Like the qualitative data analysis is like a fertile ground for slop. Like it's so easy to like, and as the models get better, it gets a little harder and harder, but it's still really easy to like produce slop if you're not careful. So I think just to underscore this, the point about like you are ultimately responsible for your work. I think if you remember that as like sort of a guiding principle as you're doing this, it's like, yeah, like are you gonna? It's so tempting to just plop the whole like folder of interview transcripts into like an AI and be like, Find me the themes." And that's like lazy, but it's easy. And it will, but the problem with, or the challenge with AI is that it doesn't judge you for being lazy. It will just do whatever you ask it to do. And so if you lazily ask it to do stuff, it will do stuff and it will confidently give you an output, which is like just a huge trap for Slop, I think. So this idea of being responsible for your outputs, like I one of my favorite ways to use AI is like to find quotes that help me go back and read like a portion of a transcript or watch a portion of a video because it's impossible to watch all the videos, and be like, oh yeah, that really was a good moment. And also then, like if you're gonna put a quote on a slide or like make claims like that, I feel like there's no way I can do that without finding the actual quote in the transcript. So using the AI as a way to like help focus your attention and target hunt for like specific quotes and then verifying them because ultimately, it's your responsibility. I feel like this is like exactly how to do that and navigate the risky waters of like slop in this domain.
Hmm. Yeah, Chris, I think that's a good point. And also just looking at some of the comments in the chat right now, I will say with this, I think this is very much AI assisted, not fully AI completed. When I was doing this type of work, I am absolutely in there spot checking. I scanned through all the CSVs before I loaded them in. I see it more as a way to time save on something that would take a really long time, not to totally offload it. I do think that being somewhat familiar with the data is really, really important to make sure it's not hallucinating. It also makes it a lot easier to spot check. Um, so yeah, like
And
big,
that
big
that just
plus
reminds me,
that.
yeah, well, that just triggered another thought, which is like, I'm a big proponent of AI moderated interviews. Hopefully, a lot of people have tried it. I feel like it's just a method that's going to stick around. The challenge inherent to that as a method is you are a little detached. You're quite a bit detached actually from. It's one thing if you moderate the interviews yourself, you sort of have a gut feeling of like, oh, I remember, or maybe the AI will trigger a memory and like, oh yeah, that was a good. I remember that when a person said that. But when you do AI moderated interviews or a survey or something like that, where you're like detached from the data itself, you don't have that like gut feel. And so that just like multiplies the possibility of slop. If it's AI moderated interviews with like lazy qual analysis, like that's a recipe for slop basically, because there's no way to like to rather you have to be just extra judicious in making sure that you avoid it. I think another thought, a final thought I had I have a lot of thoughts on this particular section. Well, a final thought I had is like, as researchers, it's always good to be like exercise like a modicum of skepticism and not just take everything that people say is true. Like you really want to like verify that it's actually supported by the data. And so the same goes with this. Like, okay, the AI said it. Like, is it actually true? I'm gonna bias towards skepticism until I feel that the data actually supports it. And I feel like all the guidance you have here really helps with that.
Yeah, absolutely. I also want to just go to one other comment I'm seeing in the chat about multiple languages. This is something I've not tried. I'm aware of a few folks I know who have used it for multiple languages where they're at least partially fluent in the other languages. So if they're, maybe mostly speak English, but they know, I don't know, some German or some French, like they're able to use it well enough, but they almost to the same point about familiarity with the data. They're like pretty familiar with the language already. It's not something where it's just doing translation. I think at this point in time, I would be really worried about trying to use AI for a language I didn't have a good working familiarity with, because I think it would be very difficult to spot hallucinations or inaccuracies. But I do think if there's a language where, maybe you're not like fluent, but you're functionally proficient enough that you can read it pretty well, that might be a really interesting use case.
And I can't. Maybe you're going to get to this in the next slide, but like this idea of like narrowly scoping the
Mhm.
task. I feel like just on the language front, like if you rather than asking for like a high level, like a broad like synthesis, which is going to be really hard to like spot check if you don't speak the language, like maybe asking more narrowly tailoring the ask that you give the AI. Just from what we were talking about yesterday, it feels like that's gonna like increase the odds of like it finding like legit information and decrease the odds of hallucination.
Mhm. Absolutely. I'm just going to move on to our next one here. I see we're kind of getting toward the end of our time. So, a few other concrete examples on quantitative data analysis. This has also been something that I've been having a lot of fun with. I think just a few lightweight things you can try, even if you're not a quant researcher. I think that one of the most useful use cases I found for AI so far personally has been coding. So there are some really nice ways you can write pseudocode and then get the AI to produce useful code for you. So, starting with the first bullet point, which is actually not coding, but just talking about stats. If you have survey data, you are getting questions, you want some quick findings. One thing that I've been doing is if you want to see if there are statistically significant differences, if you just give it the sample size and then percentages for different types of questions or anything else about that data, if you have a thinking model turned on, it's really good about letting you know if there are actually meaningful differences between two different samples or two different measurements. So that's been kind of a nice, like, okay, cool. I just want to understand this quickly. I haven't done my whole analysis without diving all the way in. That type of thing's really nice. And then moving into the coding example, I think this is really kind of the core here. Chris and I were talking about this a bunch yesterday. So I've been kind of thinking of this as like analytic vibe coding. So you're not necessarily using it to build something, you're using it to analyze data. And it doesn't work to dump in survey data, get a report, but it does work really well to produce code to analyze survey data. So if you're, a really deep quant researcher, you might use R or Python. Gemini can write that for you. So if you're able to go through and write pseudocode for, hey, this is my survey, these are the different analyses I need to run, these are the questions I need to answer, these are even data visualizations and graphs that I want, you can ask it to produce enough code that you can put into a Jupyter notebook, a Collab notebook. These take a little bit of startup time, but they're super, super easy to get started with, even if you haven't used them before. You really just want any kind of a coding notebook. It will give you, if you ask it to make it ready for you to just put into a notebook, it will give you all the different cells of what you copy and paste in to set it up. If you are a little bit more familiar with Python, for instance, you can even tell it to use specific libraries. So if you're going through and you want data visualization from Matplotlib, tell it that. It will do that. You can give it verbal directions to make it look better. So one thing that I really enjoyed is, I'll make some graphs. They look awful at first. And I'm like, no, make this look really nice. Here's a screenshot of a graph I want this to look like. Also like change the color palette and the fonts, and it will do that, which has been cool because I find that takes, for me, I'm sort of an okay coder, but not great. It takes me a really, really long time to do that if I'm actually writing code myself. But you're able to go through and just have a conversation with it. And then this is also something that's really nice. And Chris and I were kind of brainstorming on this. If you don't have an AI tool that you can put data in, you can structure the analysis that you need and get the code, and then you can copy it out of the AI tool and put it into a notebook where you're never actually sharing any data from a survey, any user data. You're literally just using it to generate that code that will be runnable. Hallucinations are also really easy to catch here because if it comes up with code that doesn't work, you'll be able to tell when the code doesn't work that it doesn't work. It's not going to be something that's insidious. It should be really obvious. And then within this too, one other kind of side note, but this was a fun one. I haven't tried this yet. I think this would probably work. I think I'm going to go try it later. If you're trying to start building a taxonomy or code book from survey open ends, one thing that you could probably do is put those in, call a Python library, use something that's like k-means clustering, any other clustering, and just start to get those clusters out. So again, if you're thinking about like decomposing this into the smallest possible tasks, it might be interesting to even familiarize yourself with what are some different stats or data visualization libraries. What are the different types of things they can do? You don't need to know how to use them. You just need to know that they exist. And then you can ask for code that will do them for you. One thing that's also helpful, if you do have a tool that you can use with real data, you can put in your CSV or copy in what your data structure looks like. If you don't have a tool you can use with real data, if you can name your column names, something that's, not going to share anything you can't share or upload anything you can't upload, and then just make a couple of rows of fake data that's in the same format, you can also put that in and it can tailor what it will do with the code so that it will work better with your particular data. And Chris, you want to add on this? I feel like the conversation we were having yesterday here was really fun.
This was, oh yeah, for sure. This is, I think, as a person that's very non-quantitative, historically at least, I think this is like this has been sort of eye-opening for me to like just play around with some quantitative analysis. You know, if like I can do descriptive statistics like fine, that's easy enough. But anything more advanced has always felt out of reach. And so recently, I just had an experience where a colleague of mine did a really great Max Diff survey, and I asked him for the data because I just wanted to play around with it. And I had AI just generate a lot of different types of analysis. And the way I was using it is maybe a little bit different than this. It was, I mean, it was generating the code and then running the analysis. I wasn't like sharing that more broadly, but it was a really cool way to help me just as I might work with a quantitative UX researcher, which is awesome, or a data scientist where you see the world from two different perspectives. I thought this is a cool the ease of being able to do some quantitative data analysis is like more sophisticated stuff is a great way to like help see your data that you're collecting in a different way, like from a different sort of angle. And in just this particular example, help me sort of discover some potential like segments in the data. I wouldn't go so far as to say, oh, this is definitely true. I totally believe everything it produced, but it helped me think through a problem I was trying to think of a little bit differently, just from a different perspective. Like, oh, I never would have thought of that. Now I have a hypothesis to dig into as I go through subsequent qualitative research. So I feel like this now I feel like it's not like this foreign thing anymore, this quantitative data analysis, largely because of AI.
Awesome. Okay, we have one more example, and then I think we'll move into some breakout groups. So this is another kind of just fun, random one. You may have used storyboards in qualitative research design or even in surveys. I know I feel like this was really trendy a few years ago, creating these like very generic storyboards of people doing things with a device, and then you would have something you told users, you would ask questions. I realized at some point last year that image generation is actually a great way to do this. If you just describe, there's a sample prompt here of what I used for this one. This was just one prompt with no refinement, but you can also tell it to refine, go back and forth. What you want the storyboard of, like simple black and white line drawing, or if you want it colored in, uh, what people or characters you want in the image, what devices they should be on, if they should be expressing emotion, if they should be doing anything else, if there's other stuff happening. It does a great job. And you can also make multiple. You can do like individual panels if you want to be really detailed. You just tell it to keep using the same character, or you could even upload, one drawing to start with and use that as the base. It just does a great job of making these nice like comic book strips. I know this is something for me when I used to do this. It either took a really long time to kind of cobble together this like sticker kit of storyboard things or work with an illustrator to make them. So I found this to be a nice, pretty light, time-saving quality is like generally good enough to use as a stimuli in interviews, and kind of fun to maybe think about using this method again because I haven't used it in quite a while.
I love this. This is that, and when we were talking about this yesterday, I was like, oh my gosh. So when we worked at Airbnb, there were so many times when Airbnb was very big on this. There's like a
Yeah.
famous presentation, I think it's still on YouTube, or a story video about Snow White, which was basically a big storyboard, and they hired an illustrator from Pixar. And I always thought like, wow, wouldn't that be cool if I could do a study where they had like a Pixar quality animation? Not that I'm endorsing people using AI to like rip off Pixar, but you don't need that level of fidelity usually for like a lot of the studies. A simple like illustration like what's shown here, I think can go so far in helping. If it's a more future-looking thing, or you're studying like something that doesn't exist in the world, and you're trying to help people um, trying to understand how you can shift their mental model. A lot of times you need stimuli like this, and having a way to produce it is just like game changing, I think. So anyway, I love this example.
Awesome. Thanks, Chris. So this is the end of the content, and I think we have maybe about 10 minutes left. Do you want to do more questions now, breakout rooms?
Well, maybe
What?
just one quick
Yeah.
question. I'll throw it out to you, Marie, before we get into the breakout rooms, which will
Mm,
have a lot more opportunities for questions. Just like I've seen some comments in the chat. There was a comment or a question that
yeah.
came in earlier too. Like just in general, and maybe this is too big of a topic, but like sometimes it seems like it's more trouble than it's worth to use AI, especially if
Mm,
you really care about the quality.
yeah.
And so like just are there any principles you have for like when should you just do it yourself? and like, not even bother with AI, or versus like when is it like definitely like no, you should totally be using AI for this situation?
Oh, that's such a good question, Chris. I'm not sure that I have a great answer for that yet. I think one thing I've been kind of using is if it's a really high stakes project, I probably won't use AI a ton, or maybe I'll use it for some really light points. But if it's something where I need to feel 100% confident that everything is perfect, I would probably be less likely to use AI. I think also if it's a domain that I'm really unfamiliar with, save for maybe some of these lit review areas, I would probably be less likely to use it. I think if it's something where I've already got quite a bit of familiarity, I think that really makes kind of the spot checking easier. I'm more likely, but if I'm just ramping up and really learning it, I think that would kind of be another one. I do think, on the quant side, for me, this actually feels like one of the easiest trade-offs to make because it's so easy to identify if it's hallucinated. You're just using it to make code. If the code doesn't work, you know what's wrong. So I think that that's been maybe one where that trade-off's not really there. If you can get code that works to do the thing you want, like great, use it. But for the qual side, I think that there is, judgment around like how certain do you need to be, and then maybe familiarity in the domain.
Yeah, love it, love it.